Welcome to my video. My name's Caleb, and I'm very into philosophy, and particularly philosophy in the sense of what is practically helpful to my life. How can I find answers about meaning? What does it mean to live a good life? What is my core identity? These practical things that I think everyone sort of asks themselves at some point in their life, or if they don't, it's just something that would be helpful to ask yourself. I want to start with like a sort of story. Um, I'm a number of years out of college now, but a couple years ago, I was talking with a friend of mine who we knew each other from college, and I was studying philosophy at the time, and as an undergrad, and he was a graduate student, but he was doing his graduate studies in philosophy, and we had a lot of deep conversations, well, just a lot of conversations in general, just about not like formal study of philosophy, that for sure, but also how these questions within philosophy penetrate into our daily lives and how is it sort of relevant in terms of where I find my meaning, where I find my purpose in life. And we were talking a couple years out of college, and looking back at those times where we'd stay late up night just talking philosophy, and he said about me, you had a sort of frenetic energy where you were desperately searching for answers. And I never really thought much of that, but I never considered that to be me. But from his perspective, from the outside, that was certainly something he thought, and it caught me by surprise. But when I thought about it, like, that really does make sense, because I have had, I think it was towards the end of high school, I had this time when I was just really asking myself, like, who am I? I think that when you lose a sort of part of yourself, like your identity, for me, that was like I put so much of my value into being an athlete. And when I was no longer an athlete on a team in college, that loss of that identity, which the thing that gave me so much purpose and which I held on to for my self-worth, a lot of it, when it is just taken away, you start to wonder, what do I grasp for? What is my identity? Where do I find my purpose and importance in society? And I think that this question of purpose affects everyone, even if you have a job, especially if you have a job that like you don't like, because the vast majority of people do not find that their job is that universal thing that they felt they were born to do. And so in college, I was on this sort of quest to figure out life's biggest questions. Things like, what does it mean to live a good life? What is my core identity? What is my purpose? And what are virtues that who is the person I should become? And kind of what is my current state at? Where am I at right now in terms of the distance I need to travel to get to the person I want to become? And I was surprised to realize that a lot of my classes in college were in philosophy were not helpful in answering those questions. They were really tailored to whatever the professor was interested in, usually like a niche topic like climate change or a specific type of social justice. But it didn't really answer the questions that I had about, like, what does it mean for me to live a good life? How do I find purpose for myself? And it was in the outside readings of philosophy, different types of philosophy that I read on my own, that I found the most fulfillment in answers to those questions. I think typically people have these misconceptions about studying philosophy where they think I think that it's incredibly, like, a lot of times it's too abstract or esoteric, so that it's this thing material that is just not relevant or practical. And some people say that you leave with more questions than you have answers, which I think that you do start to ask more questions, but I think it's a misconception to say that you don't get answers, because you do. People, prominent people in the past, have asked these universal questions about what it means to be human, and have actually made some headway, and I think provide good answers that might just satisfy a lot of people. So let's continue on with the story. For me, personally, from an early age, I got really drawn to religion and philosophy because it acknowledged realities about life that, like about like death, purpose, meaning, things that I think people think about maybe when they're alone, but they don't really share with other people because, I mean, I think a lot of us are just afraid of the answers, that there might be no answer, there might be no clear answer, and it might just be like a futile endeavor. And I guess for me, I just always thought these are the most important things in life. So why aren't we talking about it? Sure, it's controversial, but we could talk about it in a sort of way that's uh, not putting our egos first and really just trying to come to like collectively learn what is true. And for me, I realized that we're not really taught in school to argue well, and well, in and what I mean by well is the objective of a conversation or argument is to learn what is true about the world, about um, and so it's not to win. And I think that a lot of people, they come into an argument trying to win it. That's their objective. But if the shared goal, the assumption coming into a conversation or deliberation is to figure out what is true, that could be such a fulfilling conversation. And I think nowadays people are really starting to do that a little more with like podcasts. They're not looking for like this sort of arguments and winning sort of arguments with like really bad arguments just for the sake of winning. It's more, what I'm seeing is that people actually come together with like polarized views, but they could talk through these things and try to come to a better understanding of how the state of the world, where we ought to go in the future. And that is how I see good arguments being formed. Okay, so I haven't been able to really talk so much about in this sort of way because I personally have had a lot of time constraints, but things are opening up in a way in my personal life where I can talk a little bit more about my own personal values and where I want to get to. But specifically, this lifelong project of mine, it really started with inspiration from Descartes. Um, he was a prominent philosopher who he wrote, the famous dictum that's kind of associated with him is "I think, therefore I am," and for me, he writes about that in his book called The Meditations, and that book was an inspiration for this project actually. I remember I was in my sophomore or freshman year of college, where I was like, I'm gonna do what Descartes did, where he's like, I'm gonna carve out 2 weeks of my time, and during those 2 weeks, I'm gonna run through a thought experiment. I'm gonna examine my life and ask myself, what are the assumptions I have about my life? What are the biases? The things that I was sort of born into, like the society that gave me, like the place where I grew up, the town. They had these assumptions about the world that I kind of absorbed just by, being there and being socialized there. But, we carry those habits and those ways of thinking with us as we grow older. But he's like, I'm going to question all my assumptions in life. All the religion that my parents passed down to me, the philosophies, and I'm going to carve away at all of it until I know that what's left is, well, until there's like a vacuum, right? And then from there, I'm going to do, he starts after this negative process of carving out, he starts this positive process of like filling in the vacuum with, values about the world and beliefs that he knows are sturdy, that he scrutinized. And so in this way, he could build a foundation for his life and his values and his beliefs that are much stronger, that can't just be blown away by the wind or blown away by someone on social media saying something to poke holes in whatever systems of belief you have. So yeah, I got really excited about that project, and I started writing. I remember writing furiously on my iPad because like iPads were big back then for notes, still are now. But I wrote this like huge, I don't know, it was not like maybe it was like a personal manifesto, but it was just my principles in life, everything I believed or that I wanted for myself to believe, that I thought were strong beliefs, what it means to live a virtuous life. Um, just simple things like I don't want to lie to myself or other people. I want to I want to do things sort of in moderation, work hard, have discipline, these kinds of things, have courage. Um, and so I I got really into philosophy, and over time, I read a wide gamut of philosophers, about a wide gamut of philosophers and ideas. A lot of times, I read through anthologies of different philosophers, or like a history of different like Western philosophers. But one of the books that caught my attention was A History of Western Philosophy by Bertrand Russell. And what I decided for my project moving forward is to look at this book, which is one of the most comprehensive or best written accounts of Western philosophers throughout history. And it's written by a famous philosopher named Bertrand Russell, who I'll do like a short little narrative summary of his life in a second. But the book, it really, like, I read through it once. It was more of a cursory read, but I found that it was a very good foundation for understanding what are the big picture ideas that these philosophers have contributed, and what was the sort of societal milieu that motivated these kinds of philosophies to emerge. I particularly, in my project, I'm concerned not so much with the nitty gritty details of each philosophy. No, I'm more interested in the questions that answer what does it mean to live a good life. Because for me, I think other people would differ, but for me, philosophy is only helpful in my life insofar as it answers that question. So if philosophy is just pontificating about, like, how do we know that the color red is actually red, like that the sort of metaphysical stuff that, like, I don't know really what's at stake when you try to answer that question, but like I don't care about that. I care about the more relevant stuff, like what can I think about that would help me figure out what my purpose is in life. How do I think through what it is that should be getting me up in the morning, and what do these like philosophers, these great thinkers, have to say about that? And so as I proceed, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to give you a narrative account of Russell's life, Bertrand Russell. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the preface in his book, A History of Western Philosophy, because it captures how he decides to move forward with a historical account of these philosophers. And it matters because for a number of reasons, which I'll discuss. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about how I am going to integrate his writing in my sort of bigger project. I mentioned it briefly before, but I'm more interested in the question of what it means to live a good life. So first, Bertrand Russell's life in short. So Bertrand Russell was born in 1872 in Wales. He had an older brother and a younger sister, and his parents, like in his household, it was very unconventional, unorthodox in the sense that his parents were feminists at a time where there were not many feminists. They were skeptical of religion in a society that was very religious. They had an open marriage, and his mother actually had an open affair with the kid's tutor. And the father was, weirdly, he didn't even care. And his grandfather was famous. He was the British Prime Minister 2 times in his life. And so you can imagine that he grew up with a lot of wealth in the aristocratic sort of, as an aristocrat, sort of. And early in life, Russell, from his life was kind of marked by a lot of tragedies, including a lot of deaths of his family members. His mom died of diphtheria when he was 2. His sister passed shortly after that year. His dad died 2 years after his mom, and he was only 4 at that time. And then his older brother and his older brother moved to live with his grandparents because they became orphans. But the grandparents, as I mentioned, they're very wealthy and they lived on this huge estate. But then 2 years after Dad died, the grandfather died, and so Russell like describes his childhood as like very lonely and isolating. Most likely due to these deaths. And early on, he describes contemplating suicide a lot. And around, he says that what saved him from committing suicide was his love of books, and later mathematics. Those are the things that he attributes to saving his life. Around 15 years old, he started reading about the Christian faith and denied what it said in the teachings of the Bible and church. And then he described himself as an atheist by the age of 18. And at that same age, he left home to study math and philosophy at Trinity College, Cambridge. And he started to become like a sort of prodigy in the field of like making major contributions to the field of logic, math, and philosophy. And then he had this famous contribution. One of them was this paradox that he identified in. I'm gonna botch the name, but Gottlieb Frege, who was the leading figure, who was the most prominent figure in terms of logic at the time. And later, he teamed up with a guy named Alfred North Whitehead and published his seminal work, Principia Mathematica, which was like an attempt to derive math from logic. So it's kind of funny, like trying to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. And if you actually look at the proof, that like how do we know that is true? I mean, intuitively we know that just growing up developmentally, but if you want to actually try to prove that, like write a math proof for that, it takes like pages. And he that's what he worked on in this paper. He tried to derive like all of mathematics from logic. Later on, World War I came around, and then Russell was like a prominent figure at the time, and he got himself into some trouble by being like a outspoken pacifist, speaking against like Britain's involvement in the war, and later went to the U.S. and studied. No, he didn't study. He taught in L.A. and New York City, and then later won or was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1950. He had a series of unsuccessful marriages. He remarried four times, and he had periods of his life that were very tumultuous. But like in a nutshell, this is like his life. And you could learn a lot more online, but I just wanted to keep that more abbreviated. One of the books that he wrote, he had like an insane amount of output in terms of his academic work, but one of the things he wrote was History of Western Philosophy, which is like a super long book about, well, like what he thought Western like philosophy was, like the most prominent contributors. And today I'm just going to go through the preface of his book because he talks a bit about why he decided to make a book on the history of philosophers when there are other books out there, like many of them. But in his preface, he says specifically that he uniquely wants to be able to exhibit philosophy as an integral part of society, a social and political life, rather than these disparate accounts of prominent philosophers that just existed in time. And so a consequence of, he wanted to think of everything in terms of cause and effect. So there were, like, given that there were different communities and different systems by which these communities like operate, he wanted to kind of give like an evolution of, okay, this society was like this, and this led the next society to react to that system of belief in a sort of way that and in such a way that this new philosophy emerged. And so, like for example, he gives he says that the age of scholastic philosophy was an outcome of the reforms that occurred in the 11th century. And those reforms in the 11th century were in turn a reaction against previous corruption that existed. So this sort of direct cause and effect relationship that gave rise to different types of philosophies, he believed that that sort of way of looking at the history of philosophy is the best way, because it's grounded in like the realities of the world. And like the upshot of this is that um, he did omit a lot, like several different philosophers who might just have not had influence in how society would operate. And instead, he would include people who just had a lot of influence on the world, and subsequent philosophies. So people like Alexander the Great, Charlemagne, or Napoleon. And he might include these people over someone who had like less influence in society or on societies, but had maybe great philosophical ideas, like Spinoza, for example. Okay, so now that I've done the preface, I'm going to do part 3, where I talk about how this all comes together with the project that I am working on. So again, this is like a very personal project, because I'm just really in the pursuit of trying to figure out what I want to believe, and what I value, and the person I want to become, based on different types of philosophies that I encounter throughout the history of Western philosophy. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be supplementing a lot of this text with more of my own research, like primary, secondary sources, and because I mean, Russell has his own biased opinions, and he even acknowledges in the preface that he's probably not an expert on all these philosophers compared to people out there who have wrote more extensively, and some people spend their whole life studying one type of philosopher. So I'm going to be doing my best to provide a sort of accurate reconstruction of these philosophers, what they have to say, precisely why their philosophy was prominent at the time that it was given or delivered, and the sort of historical context that gave rise to that philosophy. Then I'm going to do my own commentary, just give you my honest opinions about what I think is actually helpful in this philosophy, insofar as it answers the question of what does it mean to live a good life for myself. So, I mean, if I know that because I'm recording and people are going to be able to access it, I don't imagine it's going to be like viewed by tons of people, because I'm not going to be promoting it very much. But if anyone has any questions about anything that I mention, or can help me on this journey to figuring out what is true and what is good for me, I'd really appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks for listening to this video. I decided like I don't really want to have a ton of edits for it. So I'm just going to be talking more candid like this, because it is just truly, I want it to be very authentic. These are just my thoughts after having, done some reading on these topics. I have I guess it's a sort of short script, but I just write like a small article to gather my thoughts before I make the video. The video is extemporaneous, but it is going to be motivated by and informed by me actually having done enough research to put together a little piece, like write it up, and hopefully it could be helpful to anyone just like on a commute to work or something, and just wants to hear about how I'm thinking about what's important in life.